Hey guys, welcome back to another Friday the 13th video. This time, keeping in line with the day, decided to give you guys my rankings of all of the Friday the 13th films, especially since they're all fresh in my mind from just having done a commentary per film. So without further ado, let's get into the rankings. And keep in mind, this is all just based on my opinion. So if you guys have a different ranking than what mine is displayed, don't feel bad. It's all subjective and not all lists are going to line up the same way. But the criteria of how I rank these films very likely is different from your own. So let's begin. Alright, now in order for me to do this, I did take some notes on my phone that I wanted to try to keep everything in track with my thought process as I was going through these ranking systems. Now for me, I'm going to go from worst to best. And the first one on my list probably comes as no surprise to anybody. But the worst Friday the 13th film, to me, is Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Part 8 kicks off my list with being, to date, the worst of the series. From the story to the effects, this film was absolutely terrible in my opinion. Sending Jason after random high school students that are on a cruise to New York, even though they have nothing to do with Jason in his campgrounds, aside from the final girl Rennie, who supposedly was almost drowned by Jason while trying to learn to swim with her uncle. This film took an interesting idea and completely botched its execution, ultimately leaving us with some pretty cool moments like the Times Square scene. But as a movie as a whole, it abandons the tone and formula that made the franchise so successful, making Jason Takes Manhattan the worst of the series for me. My 11th pick, from worst being absolutely last to best being number 1, is Freddy vs. Jason. While the idea was cool on its own, the execution and handling of the Jason character was completely terrible, turning Jason into a lumbering giant who was far less intelligent in this film than in past incarnations. Plus, he now has a fear of water that seemingly came out of nowhere, making this Jason, at no fault of Ken Kurtzinger, the worst portrayal to date. I lay the blame for that at the feet of Ronnie Yu. If not for him, who knows what potential Ken really had in the role. Then there's the characters. Horribly acted characters in an overly polished movie that could have been better and should have been better, but ultimately wasn't, and was very much leaning towards New Line's Pride and Joy, Freddy Krueger. While Jason did get the body count, like Freddy said, he may get the blood, but I'll get the glory. And that definitely showed in that film. Number 10, with some irony to it, is Jason X. while extremely fun to watch and has some pretty cool moments of its own, Jason X has a few downsides. The first being its comedic tone replacing the original dark tone set in the first few entries of the series, almost making Jason X a parody of what the series once was, and the setting of Grendel replacing Camp Crystal Lake could have been a cool idea if it channeled more of the alien aspect, sort of like giving us the claustrophobic, dark lighted corridors of Alien with the xenomorph hunting Ripley and her crew on the Nostromo. Jason could have done something very similar, and that movie would have been 1,000 times better. But instead, we got the first sci-fi action installment of the series, with hardly any horror elements aside from Jason being present himself. But like I said, it's still a fun watch, overall earning itself the number 10 spot on my ranking list. So I mean, I do have somewhat of a soft spot for it. But if we're talking horror, Friday the 13th, this has to be lower on the list. And I think it fits comfortably in the 10 spot. The number 9 spot, which ironically is the 9th entry of the series, Jason Goes to Hell. I dare say the only New Line film to capture a bit of the essence of the first few films, at least until Jason gets blown up. Then we are given a weird demonic origin to Jason with a family aspect, bringing Jason into Thorn Michael Myers territory. That contradicts itself unless we have other characters willing to send other characters to their death, just to keep pivotal information to themselves, to break a few more fingers. I'm looking at you, Duke. Even if it means Jason could have killed the only person who can kill him or resurrect him with a very specific dagger that isn't mentioned until near the end of the film, giving us an interesting movie, but very much a film full of fan service and inconsistent backstory. Alright, number 8 on my list is Friday the 13th, 2009. Now, while the design of Jason was pretty cool, like I have no problems with the way Derek Mears portrayed the character, I did have some issue with the other characters, giving us very generic characters in a very generic situation, and just slapping Friday the 13th on it just didn't do it for me. While I enjoy the film, it's a fun watch, and they did keep Jason himself pretty true to the character outside of taking a hostage, even if he thought it was his mother. There's no way that Jason is keeping her hostage for that long under that belief. Eventually, Jason would snap out of it and realize it's not her, as he realized with Jenny. Once he saw Pamela's head, that was it. He knew it wasn't her, which he was in possession of Pamela's head the entire time. So that would in sense make this Jason a little dumber than what people portrayed Jason in the first few films. Granted, Jason in the original series, you could argue, was longing for his mother's return and desperately wanted to believe that she was coming back. But the moment he saw her head behind Jenny, he knew instantly this isn't her, and attacked her and would have killed her. So it doesn't make sense for the remake Jason to be in possession in a shrine to his mother's head while keeping a hostage in his bunker so to speak, and keep her alive for that long under the belief that this could be her, when he's clearly, like I said, still in possession of Pamela's head. Now, the other characters were very stock. You had some comedic characters, but overall, none of them were anywhere near as likable as the original series had. Like Shelly, for instance. Shelly was a annoying dick, but he was still likable. Like, you wouldn't mind being friends with him. These guys in this, especially Trent, you had no sympathy for any of them. I mean, granted, you probably didn't have any sympathy for any of Jason's victims in the past movie, but you could at least see why they're all friendly with each other. This whole movie, I'm wondering why Chewie and everyone else is friends with this dick. Like, is it money alone? Especially considering he's so much of a dick that he cheats on his girlfriend who's out helping a random stranger find his sister that's been missing for weeks. And his first inclination is, let me grab the first hot blonde and let me cheat on her. Like, it didn't feel as good as having the characters that we had in the past Friday the 13th. And really, that took me out a good portion of the movie, just because it didn't feel like it at that point. I mean, when you have characters starting out the film hunting down marijuana plants that's growing around Camp Crystal Lake, that's their whole purpose for being around there, and you give me so much gratuitous nudity that, I mean, I like nudity as much as the next guy, but we are talking gratuitous for literally no reason. And then when you compare this to the other 4 Friday the 13th films that this supposedly tried to roll into one, this doesn't come close to those films individually, let alone as a story together. So that's what landed the Friday the 13th remake at the 8th spot. Now, brings us to spot number 7. And might surprise some of you guys, but I put Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, in this spot. The only reason this got dropped to 7 is mostly due to it being too polished and a little bit too, I would say, careful. Where I know the MPAA definitely censored a lot of the kills on here, this is one of the cleaner Friday the 13th films in terms of gore. Granted, we got the one room that had blood and everything all over the place, but we don't really get to see any of that happen. Now, I don't need to see a full-on dissection in a film to classify it as good. This Friday the 13th movie is good, but to me, it was more in line of what A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 was to that series. This brought it to sort of the MTV kind of generation. And other than that, I really don't have many other complaints. I mean, the tone of it definitely is different than the films that came before, but that's a lot of due to the polishing of the film and the director wanting to set his own tone, trying to mimic a little bit of the old black and white Universal Monsters feel, which is why even he said, like, you could watch this film in black and white and it presents itself very well to it, which I have done, and he's not wrong. It's really good in black and white, just as good in black and white as it is in color. But essentially, the tones that I was looking for just wasn't there. The portrayal of Jason was good. but overall there was just something about it that felt missing. And when I compare this to the first 4 films, you can definitely tell there's a huge difference. And I don't know if that was because of studio interference or the MPAA cutting the hell out of the film. But there is something missing. And that's what dropped it to the 7th spot for me. I mean, for you it might be higher. For me, it's at number 7. Alright, so next on my list is Part 7 at the 6th spot, giving us one of the best absolute awesome looks of Kane Hodder as Jason, of anybody as Jason for that matter. Him in this portrayal, which is his first time under the makeup and hockey mask, is by far the definitive version of Jason. Now, the reason it falls this far on my list, while it does capture the tone of the early films, is one, the story. Excuse me. The story isn't exactly there. He's just woken up and kills until he's killed. And then that starts a rinse and repeat pattern that we see after this film. Hell, that even happened in Part 6. But at least in Part 6, he had an objective. He was making his way back to the camp. And that was his whole purpose. And he just happened to see the camp is active. Therefore, bloodbath. Here, it doesn't even look like he's at the camp. He's supposedly woken up in the same spot that he was dropped to the bottom of the lake in Part 6. But then goes after people just at random. Like, it seems like even as soon as he wakes up, the first 2 people he kills, I believe, is 5 miles from Camp Crystal Lake, supposedly where he was dropped. So he woke up, traveled 5 miles to where the 2 characters' car broke down while they were on their way to Michael's surprise birthday party. I didn't want to necessarily give up the names because I don't want to try to give up too many spoilers, but there it is. So he travels 5 miles, kills these 2, and then goes back to where he was resurrected at, and then decides to start picking off these kids one by one. And it just didn't make any sense from a story perspective. And then when you have him fight against Tina, who is a telekinetic, that's when things pick up. That's when things get really interesting, and you know what this movie was absolutely based on. And you can see, like, everything up to that point was just filler. Filler and giving us some pretty good kills, like the sleeping bag, the head crush, and, you know, a couple of other things that are in there in between before we get to Tina versus Jason. But overall, because of the lack of story, this film did fall a couple of spots for me. But the rewatchability is definitely there. I can pop this in almost any time and almost never get bored of it. And even when the video game came out and I saw that trailer with that version of Jason on there, it was an instant buy for me. So yeah, definitely this fits perfectly on my rankings at number 6. Just for that reason, it's that middle of the road Friday the 13th. Not quite as good as the early ones, but nowhere near as bad as the ones on the lower tier of the list. Now, this one may surprise you, especially with it coming over Friday the 13th Part 7. And at the number 5 spot is Friday the 13th Part 5. Now, I can already hear the keyboards of many people typing away. How can I put Roy Burns over Kane Hodder's first portrayal of Jason Voorhees. Now, if I was doing a rankings of portrayals of Jason, I would absolutely agree. But this ranking is about what I look for in a Friday the 13th movie. And this film has a couple of things over Part 7. We get the continuation of the story of Tommy Jarvis as that character evolves. Maybe not as much as he did in Part 6, because he seems to be over everything in Part 6, especially once Jason is resurrected. He has one lapse moment at the graveyard, but then after that, he's just a normal guy, just trying to stop Jason and kill him before he kills anymore. The Tommy Jarvis in this film, in Part 5, A New Beginning, is by far the best portrayal of Tommy Jarvis that we had. That includes Tom Matthews and Corey Feldman. The way he portrays himself as being tortured by the memory of what Jason did to his mother, to his dog, and possibly causing him to where his sister abandoned him, especially if you go by the Jarvis tapes. This Tommy is broken, and you can see where they were leading that character. Couple that with a revenge story similar to Pamela's in the first Friday the 13th, with Roy's son being butchered at the hands of another maniac, that maniac getting locked up, causing Roy to lash out even more under the guise of Jason Voorhees and killing everybody at Pinehurst that he can possibly get his hands on. That's a hell of a story. And that's something to me that resonated a bit better than the story that they laid out in Part 7. So I enjoyed that a whole lot more. And now we get into the top 4. The first one being, well, not the first one. It is my number 4th pick. Part 2. Friday the 13th. I do love how they establish Jason in this movie and show him as being pretty intelligent, albeit he is a bit bumbling. Like, he does have moments where he's trying to trick Jenny because he sees, I guess it's either her urine or the rat's urine. I remember that going both ways, hearing in documentaries. But when he's standing on the chair with the pitchfork and the chair breaks, it is kind of comedic and bumbling from a slasher standpoint. Like, that's literally like Michael Myers in H2O, where he's got the hand on the bar where he's like slowly lowering himself down. That's essentially like him hitting a wet spot on the bar and slipping and falling on his ass. Like, that's kind of the equivalent of that. So, I mean, it does affect things a bit. But the overall story and lore that they place out there in this film really sets the legend of Jason and is really good with how they do it. It's just, they were still experimenting with the formula, so it wasn't as good as the films above it on this list, but it definitely held its own. And if you can get the chance to watch it, if you haven't watched Part 2 yet, definitely do so. It's definitely a good watch, and I have very few complaints about it, if any at all. But I leave that's all subjective. As I said, that's all for you to decide. But right now, it sits at my number 4 spot. And I think it looks very comfortable there. And I feel comfortable with it at number 4. So let's move on to the next one. Number 3 on my list, which a lot of purists are absolutely going to hate me for. Part 1 is number 3 on my list. While some people would instantly think that, like Part 5, this film has no Jason as the killer, so it should possibly be ranked even lower, I disagree. This film was a great tone setter for the series and has really good, likable characters. And of course, being set in Camp Crystal Lake doesn't hurt. Its setting is absolutely incredible, and Pamela Voorhees is a fantastic killer who really believes in what she's doing is the right thing and protecting other kids from the same fate as Jason, making her more complex of a slasher than we typically get. Put that with Tom Savini's effects. It's one of the best horror movies ever made, in my opinion. And I think, given the two films that come over it, it's not a knock against it at all. You could interchange this with any of those movies, and it's still, the rankings would be perfect. But I think after thinking long and hard about it, I would place it at number 3, just based on my criteria of movies. Mostly rewatchability. And I can rewatch part 1, but I can rewatch the next 2 a whole lot more. And the next film, number 2 on my list, is Friday the 13th Part 3. Not only because of the movie being the film where Jason first appears with the iconic hockey mask, but the tone, characters, and setting all fit really well to make a great viewing experience. And for me, it has great rewatchability, which is always a plus. And aside from the 3D camera angles and scenes, to me, part 3 fits extremely well at the number 2 spot on my list. Now, there are some issues with special effects, the eyeball on the fishing string being one of them. But that aside, I can't think of how you would improve this movie even better than what it was. And that's why it's number 2 on my list. Let's move on to the finale. Alright guys, here we go. Number 1, my favorite Friday the 13th film. Part 4, as if that's any surprise to anybody. Mostly due to it being the absolute best blending of all the elements of the first 3 films together and fitting end to the Jason Voorhees story. If it were to end there with Tommy using Jason's own machete to kill the monster that has killed so many people up to this point. And there's something about the potential of passing the torch from Jason to Tommy that was quite intriguing, but never capitalized on in later sequels. But after much thought, I believe part 4 is the pinnacle of the Friday the 13th series. But that's my rankings. And like I said in streams and other videos, the first 5 Friday the 13th films are almost interchangeable for me. But I did put some thought into this list, and as far as rewatchability and keeping them fresh in my head from the commentaries, I feel really comfortable with this list. But with that being said, what's your rankings? How do you rank the Friday the 13th films from worst to best? Comment below, let me know. And feel free to like, share, and subscribe, as well as hitting the notification bell to be alerted whenever a new video is uploaded. And so you get notifications for when I go live. For some reason I hear that's how that works now. But with that being said, I want to thank all you guys for getting me well over 1,100 subscribers. You guys are awesome, and I did this ranking for every single one of you. And I hope all of you guys are having an awesome Friday the 13th. And, as always, I am JG Darhk. And thanks for watching.